Welcome to our show. I'm Lois Lindstrom. Today I will be interviewing Nevin Martell, an author who resides in Washington, D.C. He wrote the book, Looking for Calvin and Hobbes, the unconventional story of Bill Watterson and his revolutionary comic strip. Welcome to the show, Nevin.
Thank you so much.
As you wrote in your book's foreword, Calvin and Hobbes was one of the world's most beloved comic strips for 10 years, and then on December 31st, 1995, the strip ended. And the author of Calvin and Hobbes, Bill Watterson, withdrew entirely from public view. It must have been a challenge to write about an author who refuses to be interviewed. But you traveled to many states to interview people who knew Bill Watterson and had opinions about this fascinating comic strip that featured a 6-year-old blonde boy, Calvin, and his pet stuffed toy tiger, Hobbes. In Watterson's comic strip, the blonde 6-year-old becomes everything from a dinosaur, robot, eagle, a lightning bolt, a living X-ray, a shark, a tornado, a planet. But Hobbes never changes in Calvin's mind, and they are as inseparable as they are distinct. According to the Los Angeles Times, this story of Nevin Martell's search for the elusive Bill Watterson, the J.D. Salinger of the cartoon world, is so richly infused with the spirit of Calvin and Hobbes, the genuine innocence, affection, and humor, it doesn't even matter that the author never meets his subject. So why do you think Bill Watterson was always so adverse to PR and attention when his comic strip was one of the most popular in the world?
Well, I think that Calvin and Hobbes was the creation of Bill Watterson in the sense that he put everything that he had into it, and he didn't like outside distractions. Like, he was a man who was very focused on his work, and for him the work was the goal. The goal wasn't for him to become famous, it wasn't for him to become rich, it wasn't for him to get bothered buying milk at the grocery store. For him, the whole purpose of what he was doing was to create this other world, and anything else was just a distraction and, in a way, an impediment for him from him doing what he really wanted to do.
Yes.
So none of that stuff really mattered to him. He, that never changed his focus. And I think once it became an impediment, that's what kind of drove him out of the business.
Wow. Well, I think it's so interesting that that you were inspired to write a book about Bill Watterson. I mean, because we haven't seen his comic strip in so long. And what inspired you to write about it?
Well, I was a Calvin and Hobbes kid. You know, every day I would run next door to the Nice and Easy, buy the Utica Observer-Dispatch, come back home, and as I was eating breakfast, I'd read the funnies. And the first one I always went to was Calvin and Hobbes. And it got to the point where every day I would cut out the strip and then put it in one of those little black and white composition notebooks. And, when it ended, I was in college, so, I was no longer a little kid with my mom making me breakfast. And, I always felt like a little bit of a loss over it. And when I was casting my mind around for a book idea, I had done one book that I wasn't really happy with, and I thought I should really only write about things I'm truly passionate about.
That's a good point.
You have to.
And you feel the passion in this book. It was really a good read. I enjoyed it.
Oh,
and
thank you.
I feel like I haven't been reading the comic strips in the last 15 years. What are your 3 favorite comic strips right now?
Right now, I love Cul-de-sac, which is drawn and written by a gentleman right here in Arlington by the name of Richard Thompson. He just won Cartoonist of the Year.
Great.
And I love Pearls Before Swine by Stefan Pastis. He's very snarky. He shows up in his own strips. He berates himself when he puts a bad pun in. It's a really fun strip. And I really love Doonesbury just because.
Oh, Gary Trudeau is wonderful, isn't he?
Yeah, and it's so good to see kind of his take on politics because I think he humanizes it and makes fun of it and makes light of it in a way that makes it sometimes a little bit more digestible when it's oftentimes so painful in the real news.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting to me. I thought that Watterson never allowed his comics to be licensed or merchandised in any way, so there aren't any cartoons or toys to help promote Calvin and Hobbes. Does this mean that kids today aren't being exposed to the strip and it may become a lost item in pop culture?
You would think, but actually the books are still in print. They still sell more than 1 million copies a year.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, and they're the kind of thing that a lot of parents love passing on to their kids. When I did my book tour, I met so many fathers and sons especially where the father would say, oh, you know, when he got to be of reading age, the first thing I let him read was Calvin and Hobbes. And the kids fall in love with it all over again because it has a very timeless quality. You know, it's not attached to pop culture references. It's not attached to a specific era or decade. And so kids today can still look at it and, you know, they get all the jokes, they get all the references.
Okay.
And so I don't think that there's a chance of it going out of, you know,
so it will continue on for a while. And
absolutely.
I thought, you know, I also found it was interesting in reading your book about how difficult it is to get something, a comic strip syndicated.
Sure.
What did you learn about this process in writing your book?
Well, I think that, you know, we think of the comics as like this fun, almost childish art form.
Yes.
But in fact, it's a huge business because, you know, once a comic strip gets rolling, it can be a huge cash machine for its creator and its publisher.
That's right. That's right. And all the logos and
oh my God, the characters that can become toys, and like
you
mentioned before, all the things that Watterson didn't do, you know, cartoons or T-shirts or stuffed Hobbes dolls or whatever.
Exactly.
But you know, I think it's kind of like publishing a book. People think of it as kind of an easy artistic process, but it's actually a very difficult business to navigate. And comic strips, I think, are even harder because you have to do, you know, two things really well for the most part. You have to draw really well, and you have to write very well.
That's right. Two important creative things to do.
Yeah.
Well, when you made a conscious decision to write your book in the first person, as opposed to taking a more objective stance, why did you choose to go that route with this book?
Well, I certainly didn't intend to, Lois. It was one of those things where I was writing the book as a strict biography, as objectively and as out of the picture as possible. But as I began writing the story, I realized it was an investigation, and that my investment in that investigation was incredibly personal. You know, I was really gunning.
You were such a fan, right?
I was a fan, but I also wanted to make sure that I didn't come off too much like, as I call it, like, you know, a fanboy in the book, though I think sometimes it probably strays into that, into that realm. It's okay. But, you know, there was just such a personal investment in it, and like my trying to discover, you know, who he was and where he was and what he was up to, you know, kind of my my agita and my passion for it just got wrapped up in it, and it just naturally started coming out in the writing. It wasn't something I had planned on.
Well, you know, the Calvin and Hobbes first appeared in newspapers on November 18th, 1985, and lasted until 1995.
Yeah.
I mean, why do you think Watterson quit the business when he had such a popular strip? I mean, why did he do that?
I think in part he was driven out.
Driven out?
Well, he took 2 sabbaticals during the course of the strip's publication, which is very unheard of.
Rare, yeah.
You know, Gary Trudeau's done it a couple times, but for the most part, cartoonists have to deliver every day of the year, 365. There's no breaks.
Be very creative all the time.
Yeah, and that was a huge taxation on Watterson as an artist. The battle with his syndicate, which are the people that, you know, publish his strip, was very difficult because they wanted more.
Oh
my God, they wanted everything. They wanted the dolls. They wanted the movies. They wanted it all because for them that would mean
a lot more cash.
billion-dollar industry.
Yeah.
You know, as you pointed out earlier, it was one of the most popular comic strips in the world, translated into many you know, languages around the world. So had a real global appeal. And if it was something like Peanuts, I mean, Peanuts. Charles Schulz was one of the 10 richest.
I couldn't get over that in your book. I didn't realize, was it $1 billion a year from Peanuts?
Just from Peanuts.
That's incredible.
And I mean, Garfield, you know, there are tens of thousands of Garfield endorsed products.
I wish I could draw.
I know, so do I.
What an incredible income. And then what's also interesting that, what do you think were the 3 comic strips that had the biggest impact on Bill Watterson?
Oh, that's a good question.
Back in the 80s.
Yeah, you know, I think he was definitely influenced by. Well, there are a few. There was Little Nemo, Little Nemo in Slumberland, which was from the earlier part of the 20th century, and that's a little boy who has dreams, and then the dreams are psychosomatic in the sense that if in the dream he's running away from giant mushrooms, like you'll see him then in the next frame on his bed and he'll be running.
Okay.
And that kind of playful that kind of playfulness between imagination and reality was something that I think that that he drew on.
Right.
I think that he drew on Doonesbury's sense of smartness, of intellect.
Yes.
Never talking down to his audience.
That's right.
I think that was really, really important.
Good point.
For Watterson. And I think also Peanuts actually was a big influence. Charles Schulz was a huge, huge hero of Watterson's as a kid, and actually Watterson wrote him a letter, and Schulz wrote him back, something kind of very kind of bland, and as adults we would know it to be a form letter, but
Sure.
Watterson didn't know any better. So Watterson was super excited, wrote another letter to Charles Schulz, and got the same form letter back.
Oh dear.
And it was actually a definitive moment for him because he realized that if he was ever in that position, that
He would never do that.
he would never do that.
Yeah.
And he actually answered his fan mail personally and individually for about the first 8 years of his strip. In the last couple of years, he just stopped answering
That's
letters
right. It'd be
altogether.
way too time-consuming, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, and sometimes it was just thank you for writing. But
That's right. But as you wrote in your book, Bill Watterson wrote, drew, lettered, and inked every strip. Is that amount of work by one person rare in today's world of comic strips?
Absolutely. A lot of strips, they'll have a cast of artists that work behind the scenes. They'll bring in gag writers to help prop them up.
Really? Gag writers?
Yeah. I mean, just think about those strips that have been around for 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years. To turn that kind of quantity and quality out becomes pretty
Takes a
difficult.
team, right?
Yeah.
And Bill's doing it by himself, right?
Yeah. I don't think I'm going on a limb here to say that like Garfield has as little to do with Jim Davis as it has to do with me at this point.
Yeah.
It's one of those strips that there's a whole host of people who draw it, who write for it. Jim Davis, I think, is essentially like an executive producer on the strip. Not to say that he doesn't draw or write sometimes, but for the most part,
He just kind of like
do the rubber stamp.
That's right. He just reviews it and says yes.
Looks
okay.
good. All right, guys, send it out.
Yeah, that's right.
Monday's done. Let's get on to Tuesday.
And I also thought it was interesting that you wrote that cartoon characters need to reflect the complexity of humans. And for instance, Calvin liked to play Calvin ball with the two rules, which are there are no rules, and you can never play the same game twice, right?
Right.
But what were the characteristics of his cartoon characters, Miss Wormwood, his teacher, and his babysitter, Rosalind? What would you say are the characteristics of those two characters?
Well, I think, Miss Wormwood I feel for, like I had a huge amount of empathy for, at least once I was older, because you can see like the huge pain that Calvin was for her. He put her through so much, he was constantly disrupting class. He was like, I think he runs in superhero costumes. He disrupts show and tell with all these strange things that he's bringing in. And, for me, she's the long-suffering teacher. She's been in the system for too long.
Right.
She's lost the passion.
Right.
And, I think that really comes across. I think
Yes,
he talks or she talks about going on smoke breaks. And Calvin wonders, or, maybe this is just me wondering, if she has like a bottle, like a flask hidden in the desk to help get through third period,
That's
little
right.
knock back a little. So, I mean, as an adult, I think we all know people that,
Yes.
they're in a job, they've been in it forever.
That's
they
right. Long suffering. That's
don't
right.
know what else to do.
That's right. Right.
So that's, I think that's what she did best.
Okay, and then you wrote that Calvin's dad in the cartoon is a satire of Bill Watterson's dad, who was a patent attorney.
Yeah.
How was he a satire?
Well, actually, Watterson's father was a patent attorney right here in D.C. Watterson actually grew up just a few miles from where we're sitting right now.
In Alexandria.
Yeah,
But then they moved to Ohio.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So Watterson's father was a self-admitted health and athletic nut.
Okay.
And he would drag the family on these like camping trips when no one wanted to go. And
Right.
he'd be up at the crack of dawn to eat the precursor to kashi, and then go on these long runs or bike rides.
A health nut, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that Calvin is always really disdainful of who wants to go camping in the rain to go fishing and then cut up these fish and
Right.
or who wants to get
how's this fun, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that it was a loving caricature, but there was definitely an element of mockery. And I think most people who draw parents draw on their own experiences,
Sure.
whether they write it or draw it.
That's
literally.
right. Because Watterson was really the quiet and obedient kid in school.
Yeah.
And he was quite the opposite of his comic strip hero, Calvin. Do you think it was therapeutic to Watterson to create a personality that he couldn't embrace?
I think that he got like Calvin got to live out a lot of fantasies in the strip, I think Watterson got to live out a lot of his fantasies in the strip. You know,
Okay.
maybe the path not taken,
Okay.
but some of the things actually he did do. There's a series of strips in which you know, Calvin like pelts the neighbor Susie with chestnuts from a tree, and like he actually apparently tried to do that as a kid, except as a kid he never got to do it. Like they stored the nuts up in a tree,
Right.
and then like had this grand plan, and then like went off and did something else, and it never happened.
Okay. So he could get that out in a comic strip, right?
Yeah, it was fantasy fulfillment
Yeah,
for
fantasy
everybody.
fulfillment. That's right. Now, what traits does a popular comic strip need besides good stories? What traits do they need?
I think the characters you need to be able to empathize with in some way, or at least find a common ground with.
Okay.
I think, you know, you need to laugh. You
Yeah.
know, there needs to be the element of humor. And
That's very important.
oh my goodness. I mean, because there's
Essential.
so many strips that
That's right.
you just look at and you're like,
Boring.
yeah, there's nothing. I mean, they have all the elements, but it just doesn't work.
Right.
And I think, too, that it needs to, I think what was special about Calvin and Hobbes is there were stories that had greater depth than you're expecting to find.
Okay.
There was a series of strips where Calvin finds a young raccoon that's been injured. And ultimately, at the end of it, the raccoon dies. And, you know, death is not something you expect on the funny pages.
No.
But it was treated with humor and grace and a rare insight for the funnies. And I think, you know, when I read it as a kid, I remember bawling, you know, and I mean, I still got teary rereading them
very
for the
emotional.
book.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I think we all remember the first time that we dealt with death, whether
Right,
it was
I know,
a pet
and
or a loved
That's
one
right.
or something.
It's very traumatic. That's exactly right.
Very traumatic. And if you can find some sort of solace from it in the funny pages, I mean,
That's wonderful.
That's
That's wonderful.
powerful.
It is. Well, how does a cartoonist or artist get a development deal given that comic strip real estate is so precious, and now, as you mentioned, the syndicates seem to be paying cartoonists to keep old strips going and not starting new ones? You think it's gotten too conservative here with the?
I think so. It's very difficult. I mean, you know, Cul-de-sac, which I mentioned earlier as being a favorite of mine, like that's like one of the newer strips that has really been kind of a breakout star. And he's
Okay.
been working for years as a cartoonist, so it's by no means an overnight success. I think a lot of cartoonists have to turn to the internet and are just doing a strip for the love of it and building up a readership that way.
Okay.
And then they monetize it as best they can through, you know, they might self-publish books.
Self-promote kind of thing,
Yeah,
right? Okay.
or they might make their own merchandise, or like
Okay.
they can do personal appearances or whatever. And then if they get enough momentum, then either a publisher will come along and want to do a book, or
Okay.
a syndicate will come along and want to actually publish it in papers. But as you point out, you know, the space in papers is diminishing day by day.
Day by day. It's very
as
very-
are newspapers in general.
Exactly.
So it's a tough battle.
It is very tough. And you also wrote that Watterson said he wanted to make a statement in a fair and humorous way. Do you think that his comic strip caused people to think about certain issues? I mean, do you think he,
Absolutely.
like, for instance, what issues?
Well,
I mean,
I think he dealt with a lot of things. Like there was a number of strips where Calvin's walking through the forest and he sees discarded trash, and he and
environmental issues, yeah.
they talk about environmental issues. They talk about, of all things, nuclear proliferation. There's some times when Calvin and Hobbes are like having fights, and you know, at the end of it, they both have died in the game they're playing, and Calvin just kind of asks, you know, oh, I don't quite see the point of this. You know, I mean, I don't quite get it.
Right.
And I think also too, Watterson addressed the idea of art as commerce a lot, which.
Right.
Once you know the story of Bill Watterson's life, it makes a lot of sense because that was a battle that he was engaged in. But when you read it at the strip, you do start to ask yourself, you know, like, well, what makes something popular and thus worth money? And is it, you know, worth doing if it doesn't come with all those trappings?
Right.
So I think he posed a lot of different kinds of questions.
The title of chapter 6 in your book is titled "The Machine." And it's all about merchandising and the big bucks and the big name cartoonists that are making it by harnessing the selling power of their characters. And so, like you say, cartoonists are now making millions and billions of dollars, right?
No.
If you have a big strip, you're really rich, right?
Well, I think I think it's like with a lot of things. You know, you think that because they're in papers, they're making a lot of money, but really only the top tier are making a lot of money. You know,
Like the top 5? Or
maybe the top 5, the top 10, like,
Okay.
you know, the Jim Davises
Okay.
who does Garfield, the Mort Walkers who does Beetle Bailey, they're making a lot of money.
Okay.
But most people, the men and women of the comic pages, are struggling to get by because you don't get paid much to get into a paper. You get a small fee.
Okay.
And then, you have to rely on other ways.
Well, I think that I was really surprised that Watterson was so almost like shy. I mean, he and not very open about his work. I mean, he did give a rare speech in the late '80s to discuss the cheapening of the comics.
Yeah.
Fill us in on the reaction of his colleagues to that speech.
I think, first of all, I think everyone was shocked because he had never come out to give a public speech like this before, and then the first thing that he gives is this salvo against the very art form that they're all there to celebrate. So, first of all, shock. Second of all, a lot of the people that he was talking about were sitting in the room, the people who he referred to as dinosaurs, or as the people he referred to as sellouts, or the people that he referred to as kind of gaming the system, like coming up with an idea and then letting a cast of writers and illustrators do the work for them. So it was very uncomfortable because even if you agreed with what he was saying, you were probably sitting next to somebody who he was saying it against.
That's right.
So I think it was a speech that a lot of people felt that there was a lot of worth to it, and those were mostly the young up-and-coming artists. And then the people who were the establishment, I think, just felt, I think they were angry because they don't expect to come to what's supposed to be this great love fest for cartooning and comic strips and be attacked and assailed like that.
That's right. And also, he did win awards, and he never showed up for the...
Never showed up.
What group was that? The National
Cartoonist Society. National Cartoonist Society.
Is that out of Ohio?
Well, they do the award ceremony, like it bops around. I think it's been in New York a few times.
Okay.
The speech that you were talking about before was at OSU, at Ohio State University.
Okay. In Columbus, right? Okay.
Correct. And actually, that's where all of his material is stored to this day. He gave up all of his work, and with the exception of the few he'd given away.
So if you visit Columbus, Ohio, you could go and see his work there at a museum.
Yes, they've changed the name of it, and I'll get the name of it wrong, but it's the Cartoon Art Museum at OSU.
Okay, and Ohio State University. Okay, cool.
And call ahead so they have everything ready.
And then, why was cartooning so much more demanding to create in the age before Photoshop and email? I mean, it was now it's much easier, right?
It is, because up until the last minute, you can email your editor the finished product, whereas before, there's the time that it takes to mail something, and then you have to wait for your editor to send back comments, which usually are going to come, by mail.
Right.
If without Photoshop, that means every mistake that you make, either you have to think about redrawing the thing.
That's very time consuming.
Very time consuming. Yeah. Though if you go and look at his original artworks, a lot of them have whiteout on them, which doesn't show up once you reproduce them.
Amazing.
But he did make a fair number of mistakes.
Amazing. Well, tell us about Bill Watterson's first book, simply entitled Calvin and Hobbes. Didn't cartoonist Gary Trudeau write the introduction of the book, and did they correspond a lot?
He did, and actually one of the things that surprised me the most about Watterson was that I thought of him as such a reclusive character, but once I started talking to a lot of cartoonists, so many of them corresponded with him and had these rich relationships, but just by letter. Some of them never even met the guy.
Or talked to him on the phone.
Or never even talked to the guy. One of the few exceptions to that is Lynn Johnston, who draws and writes for better or for worse.
Okay.
They had a long-standing correspondence relationship. Then she went and visited him during a cross-country trip she was taking. I guess it was in the late 80s, early 90s. And, he did have rich relationships with these cartoonists, and he was very much involved in the community of artists, of cartoon artists, and he helped a lot of young artists get off the ground by providing them with kind of criticisms of their work, but always by mail.
Okay, and then of course he had another book called Something Under the Bed is Drooling.
Yes.
Wasn't he a PR disaster in promoting that book as well? I mean, he didn't.
He didn't show. He didn't. They thought about. He has a famous quote where they said, let's do we'll get you out there for 4 weeks. We'll do a book tour.
Sure, book tour.
Get some publicity for you. And of course, most artists and authors would die for this kind of promotion.
Right, they would.
And then he says no. And they said, okay, what about just 2 weeks and no TV appearances? He's like, how about no weeks and no TV appearances?
That's right, 0
and
weeks.
We just won't do anything. And to his credit, I mean, he sold over 30 million books.
30 million books?
Without ever doing a public appearance for
Isn't
any
that
of them.
incredible?
I know.
It's just amazing.
It's amazing.
It's amazing. Watterson also was close friends with, I think, Gary Larson of The Far Side. And didn't you try to get in touch with Gary Larson regarding this book? What happened there?
So Gary Larson turns out to be just as reclusive as Bill Watterson.
Really?
Well, except for the part where Gary Larson actually let his strip be monetized to a degree. Like, he has a line of cards and mugs and some
and
of
calendars
it,
or something.
And calendars, exactly. And some of it goes to various charities. Like but you know, he as a person has kind of just gone off the map. Apparently, he lives outside Seattle. He's a huge guitar fan, and you know, routinely invites touring musicians like Fish to come over to his house and jam. But for the most part, you know, no public appearances and stays off the radar.
But you did contact Burke Breathitt, who writes the comic strip Bloom County, and that went well, right?
Yeah, when I got in touch with Burke, that was like the light finally shone down on me. Like, he was one of the greatest cartoonists in the 80s, and you know, he was one of the most respected, still is. And to have him, you know, be able to comment on both Watterson in terms of cartooning in general and as just a person that he knew, it was invaluable.
It was a very exciting part of the book. Yeah.
That was key.
Now, and did you use social media to publicize your book, and was that helpful to you?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, as every author I'm sure tells you, it's so hard to find promotional devices for your book and so hard to get the word out there. So I used Twitter and Facebook and a website, and you know, did this great promotion with the website Boing Boing.
Boing Boing, okay.
Boing
now,
Boing.
Your book was published in 2009.
Correct.
And it's in all the bookstores, and it's on the web. It's Amazon.com. And,
Absolutely.
And then now you have a website too, right?
Yep, NevinMartell.com, and I tweet under looking the number 4 Calvin.
Okay. You also had a cool conversation with Bill Watterson's mother, Catherine, and what did she say about her son's decision to end the strip? I mean,
well, you know, again, that was just such a huge get for me. You know, I was really dispirited by the end of the project because it became apparent that though Bill Watterson was going to communicate with me to a degree through his editor, to basically say, no, I'm not going to talk to you, I wanted someone really, really close to him, and to speak to her was just incredibly insightful. And I think, you know, it was interesting because as a mother, she's obviously so protective of her son, and yet she was so open with me, and I think that she could see over the decade that he drew the strip the toll that it exacted on him. And, you know, as a mother, she didn't want that happening to her son. And as a reader of the strip, she didn't want the strip to ever be anything less than great.
Yeah.
And I think she supported him for both those reasons.
It was interesting to read your interview with her. I was very, you felt closer to Bill Watterson after reading about what she said about her son. I thought it was really, really cool. And so we're coming close to the end here. People can read about your future projects also at your website,
Absolutely.
right? www.nevinmartell.com.
Correct.
And you're going to be writing, I think you said, about food next, right?
The next project hasn't been set in stone, so I can't say what it is, but it will be food related. That's as far as I can go.
And you have a couple other books out there right now that you've written on other subjects too, right?
Yep. I wrote one on for Lego called Standing Small, a celebration of 30 years of the Lego minifigure, and one on the Dave Matthews Band, and another on the musician Beck.
Okay, so you're a full-fledged writer here in the Washington, D.C. area, and so
absolutely.
We wish you all the success in the world.
Thanks,
and
Lois.
Thank you for being at Bookman's Corner.
Thank you for having me. It's been fantastic chatting.
Great. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to having you here for the next edition of the Bookman's Corner.